My name is Adiz Over. I'm 29 years old. And the evening my sister introduced me to her fiancé's family as the one who couldn't be trusted at gatherings was the evening I finally understood that the most dangerous story in a family is the one nobody ever bothers to check. She said it before I had finished my first glass of water. We were in my parents' living room, furniture pushed to the walls, borrowed folding tables along the windows, about 30 people in the kind of loose clusters that form when a guest list is half family and half people you are trying to impress. My sister Chinyere had been moving through the room with her fiancé, Marcus, making introductions, and when they reached the corner where I was standing near the bookshelf, she put her hand on Marcus's arm and said, to his mother and his aunt who were standing with him, "And this is my sister Adiz. She has a history of episodes. We've learned it's better if she's not involved in the planning side of things. Just easier for everyone." My father, passing with a tray of glasses, stopped and said, "She's always been the difficult one. The family knows." Marcus's mother, a woman named Dr. Philippa Senu, who I had not yet been introduced to, who was holding a teapot she had just lifted from the sideboard, set the teapot down. I smoothed the front of my dress with one hand, a slow downward motion from sternum to hip, and looked at the middle distance between my sister's shoulder and the window behind her. I did not correct either of them. I did not move from where I was standing. I picked up my water glass again and held it at my side and waited for the introduction to conclude. What none of them knew, what Chinyere had no way of knowing when she planned this party, when she drafted these introductions in her head, when she decided that this was the frame she would use for me in front of the family she was marrying into, was that Dr. Philippa Senu had been the attending psychiatrist on the inpatient unit where I had spent 11 days 8 years ago. She had conducted my intake assessment. She had reviewed my case 3 times weekly. She had signed the discharge summary that concluded I had experienced a single acute stress response precipitated by a documented external event, that I had no underlying psychiatric diagnosis, and that I was clinically cleared for full return to daily life, without ongoing psychiatric support. She had also, in those 11 days, spoken with my family twice. Once with my mother alone, and once with both my parents. My sister had not been present at either conversation. She had been 21 and away at university and had received whatever account my parents had given her, which was, I would learn much later, not the account in the discharge summary. Dr. Senu recognized me the moment I walked into the room. I had not recognized her. I had been 21 during those 11 days, and she had been one of 4 physicians I interacted with, and my memory of faces from that period was incomplete in the way that memories from high-stress periods often are. She had recognized me, said nothing, poured tea, and waited. She waited until Chinyere and Marcus moved on to the next group. Then she set down the teapot and walked across the room toward me. Let me tell you what those 11 days 8 years ago actually were, because the story my family had been telling about them was not the story in Dr. Senu's records, and the distance between the 2 versions is the entire shape of what happened that evening. I was 21 when I started my second year of a biochemistry degree at a university 4 hours from home. The first year had been manageable, difficult in the ordinary ways, but manageable. The second year began with the breakdown of a 4-year relationship, the simultaneous discovery that my closest friend at university had been sharing personal information about me with people in our department, and a research supervisor who created a working environment that a subsequent university review would formally characterize as hostile. These 3 things happened within 6 weeks of each other. I was 21, and I had no established therapeutic relationship, and I did not know how to triage what I was experiencing, so I did not triage it. I kept going to the lab. I kept submitting coursework. I stopped sleeping in any reliable way. At the end of the 6th week, I had a panic attack in the university library that lasted 40 minutes and resulted in the campus health service calling an ambulance as a precautionary measure. The ambulance took me to the hospital. The hospital admitted me for observation. After the observation period, a psychiatric consultation was requested as standard protocol following an acute episode of that presentation. The consultation resulted in an 11-day inpatient stay while the clinical team assessed my baseline and ruled out underlying conditions. What they found, across 11 days of structured observation, daily clinical contact with Dr. Senu and her team, and 2 rounds of psychological assessment, was that I did not have an underlying psychiatric condition. What I had was an acute stress response to a documented accumulation of significant stressors occurring in a person with no prior psychiatric history and no family history of psychiatric illness. The discharge summary stated this with the particular precision of a document that is intended to be read by future clinicians. No diagnosis, no ongoing medication, no follow-up psychiatric care required, cleared for return to academic and daily life. I returned to university. I took a reduced course load for 1 term with the support of my academic department, which had also been managing the situation with the research supervisor and which was, in that term, more supportive than I had expected institutions to be. I completed my degree in 4 years as planned, with a final year average that I was not disappointed by. I went on to a postgraduate position in pharmaceutical research. I had been working in drug development quality assurance for 5 years at the time of Chinyer's engagement party. I had never had another episode of any kind. What my parents had told Chinyer, when she was 21 and away at university and calling home to ask what had happened to me, was something compressed and imprecise. I know this because I eventually asked my mother directly years later, and she said she had not wanted to go into the clinical details with Chinyer over the phone, and that what she had communicated was that I had been unwell and had needed to be hospitalized, and that the family had found it very difficult. She had not communicated the discharge summary's conclusions. She had not used the phrase acute stress response or no underlying diagnosis. She had said unwell and hospitalized and very difficult, and Chinyer had built her understanding from those 3 words and the years of subsequent family behavior that had treated me as someone requiring management. This is the structural shape of it. My parents were not lying to Chinyer. They were simplifying a medical situation they themselves had understood only partially, in a language they were not fully equipped to translate, to a child who was away and frightened. The simplification had calcified over 8 years into a family consensus. I was the difficult one. I had episodes. It was easier when I was not involved in planning. Chinyer had never read the discharge summary.
She did not know it existed.
I had known about Marcus for 14 months before the engagement. Chinyer had mentioned him first in a phone call the previous spring, then in increasing detail as the months progressed, and I had formed the impression of a man who was methodical and even-tempered, and who was devoted to Chinyer in a way that was legible even through her descriptions of him. I had met him twice before the engagement party, once at a family dinner and once at a birthday gathering for a cousin, and on both occasions he had been quiet and attentive in the way of a person who observes before he speaks, which I respected. His mother I had not met. His family was from a different part of the country, and the engagement party was the first occasion on which both families were in the same room. I had dressed carefully for the party. This is a thing I want you to understand, not as vanity, but as intention. When you have spent years being the family's example of instability, you become very deliberate about how you present yourself in family rooms. You choose clothing that cannot be described as disheveled. You arrive on time. You greet people with the appropriate warmth. You do not drink more than 1 glass of anything. You stand near the bookshelf with your water, and you are pleasant to everyone who approaches you, and you do not give anyone a behavioral data point that can be used to update the consensus. I had been doing this for 8 years. It was not exhausting by that point so much as habitual, the way certain kinds of vigilance become habitual when they have been necessary long enough. Chinyer and I were not close. We had not been close since before the hospitalization, if I am being precise about it. We had a 4-year age gap and had occupied different social worlds through adolescence, and the hospitalization had installed a particular kind of distance that had never fully closed. She was not cruel to me in daily life. She called on my birthday. She responded to messages. But she held me at the specific remove of someone who has been told to be careful, who does not fully understand what she is being careful about, and who has therefore decided that careful means distant. She had never asked me directly about the hospitalization. Not once in 8 years. I had told myself this was because she did not want to upset me. I think, now, that it was because she did not want the answer to complicate the account she had been given, which had settled into something manageable, and manageable was what she needed. The engagement party had been running for approximately 40 minutes when Chinyer made the introduction. After she and Marcus moved on, I stayed where I was near the bookshelf and I held my water glass and I looked at the window. Outside, It was early evening in October, and the light was the specific gray gold of late afternoon giving up, and the neighbor's maple tree had gone fully orange and was moving slightly in a wind I could not hear through the glass. Dr. Senu crossed the room in the measured way of someone who has decided to do something and is not going to hurry about it. She stopped a few feet from me and said, "Adiz over." Not a question. I looked at her. I said yes. She said, "I'm Philippa Senu. I was on the team at Northgate Hospital in 2016. You were a patient of mine for 11 days. I looked at her for a moment. The face was coming back now, slowly, the particular quality of attention that a clinician has when they are observing you, which is different from the attention of a social acquaintance, more precise and more patient. I said, "I remember." She said, "I wanted to introduce myself properly before any confusion arose." She said this quietly. We were in a corner, and the room's noise was enough that a conversation at normal volume did not carry far. I heard what was said just now. I said, "I know." She said, "Is there anything you would like me to do?" I held my water glass. I thought about this question, not performatively, but actually thought about it because it was a real question and it deserved a real answer. I said, "I don't want a scene." She nodded. She said, "That's not what I'd suggest." I said, "Then whatever you think is appropriate." She looked at me for a moment with a particular quality of attention I remembered, and then she said, "I'll speak with Marcus and his family directly." Quietly. "Is that acceptable?" I said it was. She said, "You should know that my recollection of your case is clear. The discharge documentation is also in the hospital's record system. These are not things that are in any dispute." I said I knew that. She said, "Good." And then she said, "You look well." I said I was. She nodded once and went back across the room. I watched her go. She returned to the sideboard, picked up the teapot, and refilled 2 cups, Marcus's aunt's first, then Marcus's, with the unhurried movements of a person who is not performing calm, but simply has it. Then she set the teapot down and turned to Marcus and said something I could not hear. Marcus's expression shifted. Not dramatically, he was, as I had assessed him, a person who processed things before he showed them. But something changed in the set of his jaw. His aunt, who I would later learn was a retired nurse and who had the occupational habit of extracting clinical information efficiently, asked what appeared to be 1 or 2 short questions. Dr. Senu answered them. The conversation lasted perhaps 4 minutes. Then Marcus turned and looked across the room at Chinyere. Chinyere was talking to my mother near the windows. She had her back to Marcus's family. She did not see him looking. My father was standing near the hallway with a cousin he worked with. He was laughing at something. He had not registered any of this. I finished my water. I set the glass on the bookshelf and I picked up my coat from the chair where I had put it and I walked to the hallway and into the bathroom and I stood at the sink for a moment with the water running cold and my hands under it, looking at the mirror. My face looked the way it always looked at family events, the careful composure of someone who has been managing a room for a long time. I dried my hands. I turned off the tap. I went back to the party. Chinyere found me 40 minutes later. By that point the party had settled into the later evening register, dessert on the table, conversations quieter and longer, Marcus's aunt and my mother in an extended exchange near the sofa that appeared to have nothing to do with me. Marcus himself had been in a conversation with Chinyere for approximately 15 minutes near the kitchen door. I had watched this without watching it, in the way you watch a situation you are adjacent to when you have decided not to insert yourself. Chinyere came to where I was standing. I had moved to the hallway, retrieving something from my coat pocket, and she said quietly, "Marcus told me." I said, "Okay." She said, "I didn't know about the discharge summary." I said, "I know you didn't." She said, "Mom and Dad told me you had been, that you had needed to be hospitalized, and that the family had been through a lot." I said, "That's not inaccurate. That's just not all of it." She was quiet. Her hands were at her sides. She said, "I have been telling people something for 8 years that wasn't the full picture." I said, "Yes." She said, "In front of Marcus's mother." Her voice changed slightly on the last word, the particular shift of someone who has just understood the full radius of what they have done. I said, Dr. Senu handled it well. She did not make a scene. Nobody in that room is going to carry a damaging account of what happened tonight. I meant this. I was not offering it as consolation. It was simply accurate. What you need to think about is the account inside this family. That one is yours to correct. She said, What does that mean? I said, It means that at some point, not tonight, not at a party, you and I sit down with mom and dad, and we look at the discharge summary together, and we have an actual conversation about what happened 8 years ago, and what it did and did not mean. And then the family stops operating from a story that was never accurate to begin with. She said, Will you do that? Sit down with us. I said, Yes, but I am going to bring the discharge summary, and I need everyone in the room to actually read it. She said she understood. I said, Chinyur, I'm not angry at you for not knowing something you were never told. I am asking you to act differently now that you do know. She looked at me. She said, What was it? The thing that happened, actually, what was it? I told her. Not the clinical summary that could wait for the family conversation, but the outline, the relationship, the friend, the research supervisor, the 6 weeks, the library, the ambulance that had been precautionary, the 11 days that had been diagnostic and not correctional. I told her in the hallway of our parents' house while the party continued in the other room and the light from the living room came under the door and fell across the carpet between us. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, That sounds like a very hard 6 weeks. I said, It was. She said, I'm sorry I wasn't, that I didn't know. That I wasn't. I said, You were away. You were told what you were told. I'm not holding you responsible for what you were given. She said, But the things I've said since.
To people.
To Marcus. I said, You have an opportunity to correct those things. That's what I'm asking you to do with it. She nodded. Her hands came together in front of her in the particular gesture of someone who is trying to hold something steady. Then she straightened and said she needed to go back to the party, to Marcus, and I said of course. I watched her go back through the door. Then I got my coat from the chair and said my goodbyes and drove home. The drive was 40 minutes, and I did not put the radio on. I drove on the motorway with the road lit orange from the overhead lights and the maple trees at the edges of the carriageway already in their October state, and I thought about the discharge summary that was in my filing cabinet at home, in a manila folder behind the one marked medical and in front of the one marked university. I had kept it because I am a person who keeps documents. I had kept it in the same way that I keep my degree certificates and my employment contracts and the letter from the university's Research Ethics Board regarding the supervisor, a letter that itself had arrived 2 years after I graduated, as the conclusion of an investigation I had not initiated but had been interviewed for, and which had resulted in the supervisor's contract not being renewed and a formal apology to affected students, of which I was one. I had kept that letter too. None of these documents required an occasion to matter. They mattered because they were accurate, and accuracy has a way of eventually finding its use. The family conversation happened 6 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon at my parents' house, the 4 of us at the kitchen table. I brought the discharge summary. I also brought the letter from the university's Research Ethics Board, not because it was necessary but because my mother had been, for 8 years, under the impression that the research supervisor situation had been my failure to adapt rather than a formally documented case of misconduct, and I thought it was time she had the correct information. My father read both documents twice. He did not say anything for several minutes. My mother read the discharge summary once and set it down and looked at the table. Chinyur had read it before she arrived. I had sent her a scan the week before, and she sat with her hands around a coffee cup and did not add anything, because there was nothing to add. My father said, eventually, "We told her the wrong thing." I said, "You told her what you understood. What I'm asking now is that the family works from what's in that document." My mother said, "We said difficult for years. To people." I said, "Yes." My father said, "To your face." I said, "Yes." There was a silence. My mother reached across the table, not toward me but toward the discharge summary, and she turned it so the text faced her again, and she read the last paragraph once more. The paragraph that said, "No underlying psychiatric diagnosis established. Patient cleared for full return to academic and daily activities. No follow-up psychiatric care indicated." She said, "I didn't understand what they meant when they said that to us at the hospital. I thought cleared meant they hadn't found anything yet." I said, "It meant they had looked carefully, and the answer was that there was nothing to find." She said, "I should have asked." I said, "Yes." There was another silence. My father said, "What do you need from us?" I said, "I need the family to stop using the word episodes. I need you to tell the people you have told, cousins, aunts, whoever has heard a version of this, that you got it wrong. Not a formal announcement, just the correction when the opportunity arises. And I need Chinyer's engagement to proceed without me carrying a footnote." My father said he could do that. My mother said she was sorry. She said it plainly, without elaboration, and I received it the same way. Chinyer said, "Marcus already knows." His mother told him, properly, that night at the party. I said I was glad. We sat at the kitchen table for another hour. At some point my mother made more coffee. At some point my father said something about the maple tree in the front yard that needed to be cut back before winter, and whether he should do it himself or call someone, and the conversation moved in that direction, and we talked about ordinary things for a while, and it was not a transformed family. We were not 4 different people than we had been that morning, but we were 4 people sitting at a table with the same documents in front of us, working from the same facts, and that was different from before. Dr. Philippa Senu attended the wedding the following spring. Marcus's family was warm and included me without ceremony in the way that families do when they have received accurate information and decided to act accordingly. His aunt, the retired nurse, sat next to me during the reception dinner, and we talked for a long time about pharmaceutical quality assurance, which she found more interesting than I had expected, and about the research misconduct case, which she had firm professional opinions about. Dr. Senu and I spoke briefly during the cocktail hour. She asked how the quality assurance work was going, and I told her about a project that was taking more of my time than I had planned, and she said that was usually the sign it mattered. I said I thought that was right. She said, "Your family did better than some do with that conversation." I said, "They had the documents." She said, "Not everyone uses the documents even when they have them." I said I knew that. I said I thought my father's willingness to read something twice before speaking was probably the thing that had made the difference, and she smiled in a way that suggested she had seen the same dynamic play out in the other direction many times. We said goodbye at the end of the evening, and I did not expect that our paths would cross again in any formal way, and they have not. That is the natural shape of it. She appeared in my life once at 21, and once again at 29, and both times she arrived with information and delivered it without drama and then returned to her own life. That is more than most people manage. The discharge summary is still in the filing cabinet, behind medical, in front of university. I have not needed to produce it again. What I know now that I did not know at 21 is that the records you maintain in the ordinary course of a life, the documents you keep not as weapons but as a matter of accuracy, are not inert. They are patient. They wait in manila folders and in hospital record systems and in the files of research ethics boards, and they do not require your intervention to remain true. They simply remain true, and when the moment arrives in which truth is needed, they are there. You do not maintain accurate records so that a psychiatrist will correct your family story at an engagement party. You maintain them because precision about your own life is something you owe to yourself, and because the alternative, living inside a version of your history that was simplified by other people's limited understanding, is a smaller life than the one the documents describe. I live from the documents. Not as armor, not as evidence to be deployed, but as the simple factual floor of who I am. Everything else is built on top of that. Thank you for spending this time here. Every week I sit with a story like this one. A story about a person who carried an inaccurate account of herself for longer than she should have had to, and what happened when the record was finally allowed to speak. And every week I am grateful that there are people who want to listen. If this is your first time here, welcome. If you have been here before, thank you for coming back. Subscribe if you want to be here when the next one goes up. Share this with someone who has been handed a version of themselves that doesn't match who they actually are. And if something in this story found you, leave a comment. The comments here are the best part of what we do, and I read them. I'll see you in the next one.